item 71.
Item 71 is the motion establishing a process for official misconduct hearings at the Board of Supervisors.
Colleagues, discussion. Supervisor Campos.
Thank you, Mr. President. And colleagues, I pulled this item simply because I think it might be helpful for us to just have maybe a brief discussion about this. One of the things, one of the points that I found to be at least a point that deserves some consideration is this idea of how the matter is presented as this proceeding moves forward, and specifically the point about the current proposal that would essentially allow each party 20 minutes to make a presentation, and then it would also allow for the Ethics Commission as well 20 minutes to present a presentation, to do its presentation. And, you know, when we have seen this process play itself out in the land use context, when you have the planning department do its presentation, you know, what usually happens is that the planning department sides with one of the parties. And so you end up having a situation where you have, you know, whatever the amount of time given to each one of the parties, and to the extent the planning department gets the same amount of time, you essentially have more time that's ultimately used for one side or the other, one perspective, if you will. So I want to be mindful of the point that to the extent that the Ethics Commission rules or makes a recommendation one way or the other, by giving them 20 minutes, are we creating a situation where you are essentially giving one side, whichever side the Ethics Commission decides to agree on, if that's what happens, more time to make the case? And my hope would be that whatever is presented by the Ethics Commission, that would be a factual, objective presentation, and that the evidence itself would speak for itself. I don't know that that is necessarily precluded by what is before us. I don't know if that necessarily guarantees it. So that's the reason that I raised this issue, because I know that all of us want to be as fair in whatever we come up with as we possibly can.
Thank you, Supervisor. Is there any additional discussion? Supervisor, are you making a motion? Supervisor Avalos.
I actually concur with Supervisor Campos. I do believe that having the Ethics Commission present in 20 minutes to us will create, you know, a preponderance of support for either side, whatever side it lands on. And, you know, I actually believe that having a written document from the Ethics Commission that will be a product of the proceedings that are coming from the Ethics Commission will be something that will have a lot of public vetting through various media outlets before it even gets to us. It gives the public a lot of chance to weigh in on the document that could come out. It would be available publicly online before we actually go into those proceedings. I think that would be sufficient to have before us as a document that could engage us in discussion, and then either side could present their points of view. If we were to take out the presentation from the Ethics Commission, to me would give us opportunity to review that document for the Ethics Commission. We could actually ask questions of the Ethics Commission as to their product, and then go on to presentations from the mayor's side and the defendant's side, the sheriff's side. So I'd like to propose a motion to actually change that language in our resolution, offering the ability to, or the taking out the Ethics Commission presentation of 20 minutes and just reviewing a document, but allowing the Ethics Commission to actually answer questions we might have based on that document they provide.
So Supervisor Avalos has made a motion, if I understand it, that instead of having a potential presentation of up to 20 minutes, that there not be an opportunity to make an oral presentation except for answering any questions that may be provided by colleagues. And is there a second to that? Seconded by Supervisor Campos. Supervisor Cohen.
Thank you. I'd just like to speak to the motion a little bit, I guess, as a point for clarification, and also to say that we have an established pattern here when we have a formal way of doing business and hearing matters, as what Supervisor Campos stated earlier. I mean, planning would make a presentation. A lot of time is regulated. I think my concern with the motion that you're proposing is that there may be that I would not have an opportunity to listen to some of the reasoning that the Ethics Commission may have, that they would be able to articulate that quite possibly their written document wouldn't reflect, or certain inference that the written document wouldn't necessarily reflect. So I would be interested in hearing from the Ethics Commission, 20-minute presentation from them.
Supervisor Campos.
And again, I raise this issue because as I noted, we have a process, but I do think that what we're dealing with is something that could very well be, it's very unique, and so I don't know that the same process necessarily applies. I actually like what Supervisor Avalos is proposing, and maybe this is a question for our counsel. Like, I don't know, for instance, the extent to which the Ethics Commission would actually make a presentation the way that usually happens in a land use proceeding. My understanding is that there might be limitations on what ethics can actually say, or what kind of explanation is provided, because to the extent that ethics is acting as a body, you're talking about all members of that body acting as part of that body, and so I don't know that one individual can come here and make that presentation. So the reason I like what Supervisor Avalos is talking about is because in a way it sort of what ethics forwards speaks for itself, and so if we have questions, we can ask questions. So that would be a question through the chair to our counsel.
To our counsel, Mr. Emplich.
Thank you. The issue here is a little different, admittedly, from a planning commission hearing. The process that was set up here is modeled after the process that you're used to when a commission comes before you and you hear a staff report. The difference here is that the Ethics Commission doesn't have a staff member with particular expertise in official misconduct that can come here and answer questions within that area of technical expertise. The Ethics Commission votes as a body on some recommendations and passes those on to you. And admittedly, there is an issue as to whether you could even ask them questions about what those recommendations mean, because those recommendations were voted on by the body, and someone may not be comfortable or may not even be in the position to explain beyond what that written document is. So it is a unique situation. As I've been counsel for the Ethics Commission through this process, my anticipation of what the Ethics Commission would do when it comes to you is provide you with a written record, be here to describe for you the process they went through. If you have any questions about the process that they went through, answer those questions. But I think the Ethics Commission would justifiably be uncomfortable trying to explain or expand upon whatever recommendations or findings they made, since those findings were made by the body as a whole, not by any one particular member of the Commission. As a background, I think the fundamental issue here is due process. Are the parties being provided with due process? I don't think this issue is a due process issue. However you decide, whether you want to hear from the Ethics Commission, whether you don't want to hear from them, whether they talk to you for 5 minutes, whether they talk to you for 20 minutes, I don't think that's a due process issue. It's just an issue of what will best serve you in your decision-making process.
Mr. Enblich, if I could just follow up with one question. So you said the amount of time, whether it be 5 minutes or 20 minutes, doesn't necessarily impact the due process issue. So we could, for example, choose to ask for potentially a 5 or a 10-minute presentation as opposed to a 20-minute presentation.
Absolutely.
Okay. Colleagues, I would just throw that out there as a possible idea if folks feel comfortable with that. But again, why don't we continue the conversation? Supervisor Ellsburn.
Yes, President Chu, you took the words out of my mouth. Colleagues, I very much appreciate kind of theoretical legal discussion we're having, but let's also think about the practical. We've heard defense counsel concede we can ask questions. I think I've heard both Supervisor Campos and Supervisor Avalos make the point we can ask questions. I think Supervisor Cohen absolutely nailed the point of what we'd be doing. We'd be asking them questions to understand their rationale. If we say they don't get to talk, come on, I think we all know practically what's going to happen. There's probably going to be an hour, 2 hours of questions. They're still going to speak. So if it shows us being responsive to the concerns, I'm all for saying cut it down from 20 minutes to 10 minutes. I get that. But let's be real about what's going to happen. The Ethics Commission is going to be standing, I don't know where, but they're going to be talking for a good deal of time, and I would expect all of us are going to have a lot of questions. And to Supervisor Avalos' point about the media summarizing it, that's actually one of the reasons why I think they should present, especially for the public, in that we've all experienced the way the media summarizes things. We all know they don't necessarily always get it right. And I think not only us as the judge in the situation, but the public would very much benefit from their presentation. So while I think it's important for us, the broader sunshine point, the broader disclosure point, I think are better served by giving them that opportunity. If 20 minutes is too long, fine, but let's also be real. They're going to be up there for, I would assume, for a very long time.
Supervisor Wiener.
I agree with Supervisor Ellsburn, and I will not be supporting the motion by Supervisor Avalos. I do understand Supervisor Avalos's point, but I don't see any downside to providing for a presentation by ethics. They're going to be able to say what they can say, and if there may be, it could be that it's a very brief presentation, and maybe even if we start asking them questions, there's not very much they can answer, depending on the various issues that counsel has raised. But I do think it is beneficial to us and to the public to hear the rationale orally, or at least whatever it is that they're able to say about the decision itself, the bases, for the public as well to hear that, and not just to have to go online somewhere and find a document and read it, because we want to make sure that whatever we're doing, that it is broadcast as widely as possible, that people know what's happening, understand the recommendation, and then ultimately understand the decision of this board. And Supervisor Ellsburn is totally right that whatever we decide in these rules today about whether ethics can do a presentation, any member of this board can say, hey, Ethics Commission, can you please describe to me your recommendation and the rationale for it, and then they would make their presentation, but it wouldn't have a 20-minute time limit anymore, because presumably they just answer the question. So I think having a structure in place where they get a certain maximum allotment of time with and an ability to communicate that information would be useful. And in terms of weighting the scale, because they're going to recommend one way or the other, so it'll increase the amount of time devoted to one side or the other, I don't agree with that for a couple reasons. First, I don't want to prejudge how ethics is going to communicate its recommendation, but I think it might be safe to speculate that there could be, they might, even though they recommend one way, may talk about both sides. I don't know what they're going to do, so I don't want to presuppose how they're going to make their recommendation and whether they're going to give pros and cons. And this is a board of experienced, sophisticated elected officials who make decisions and hear appeals and hear pleas all the time. And there are plenty of times when you have public comment or emails weighted in one direction, this board goes in the other direction because we make a decision on the merits. So I'm not concerned that we're going to be somehow unduly influenced if there's more time given to one side or the other based on the recommendation of ethics. So that's my take.
President Chu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, colleagues, I appreciate the discussion. I want to first say that I think the challenge and the struggle that I hear from Supervisors Avalos and Campos is we want to make sure that the Ethics Commission doesn't use their time to argue, that they are simply laying out what is potentially in their written record. That being said, I certainly also agree with the sentiment that if we don't give the Ethics Commission any time to present and we start peppering them with questions, it will likely be confusing to the public as to exactly what we're talking about. It will appear to be a bit uncontextual. And so what I would like to propose, colleagues, is that we shorten the amount of time from 20 minutes to 10 minutes for the oral presentations, and it's clear, as is stated in the resolution, that the Ethics Commission may make an oral presentation explaining its recommendations not to exceed 10 minutes, and then, of course, at that point, we can ask as many questions as we want, which would extend the time or not, depending on how long we want to ask. I do want to just mention for the public who are watching this discussion that it is our practice that as long as there are questions from colleagues to any of the parties during the proceeding, our colleagues can ask that. So with that, I'd like to make that motion to see if we can help move this conversation along.
So we have a motion by President Chu. Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Wiener. Supervisor Avalos.
Just, I'm willing to rescind my motion, but I would like you to restate yours just so it's clear.
Through the chair, the only thing that would change about my amendment is simply changing the time frame from up to 20 minutes to up to 10 minutes for a set presentation, and the rest of it would remain the same.
And point of information, that's only pertaining to the Ethics Commission, correct? Yeah.
And just to be clear, so I say it into the microphone, that is only pertaining to the Ethics Commission, so that both the mayor and the sheriff would continue to have their opportunity to make presentations of up to 20 minutes. And then again, that time could be extended if there are additional follow-up questions. Supervisor Farrell.
Thanks. And this is a question to our counsel. Again, you talked about what they may or may not say. Could you elaborate a little bit more? Because we're talking about 20 minutes versus 10 minutes. And again, because of our questioning ability, we could take that could be extended ad nauseum, so to speak. In your anticipation, what would they be saying if they're not going to spend a ton of time arguing?
Well, first, I don't know who will be making the presentation to you, whether it will be the president of the commission or whether it will be the executive director. But I would anticipate that if, for example, the Ethics Commission made finding X, and they had a written explanation as to why they found X, and they transmitted that to you. If you asked a representative of the Ethics Commission, well, what did you really mean by X? After they'd voted that this is the way they want to transmit their finding to you, and these are the words they want to use, that the representative of the Ethics Commission might very well say, I can't really tell you anything more about that other than what's in the findings that were voted upon by the Ethics Commission. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't a range of questions you might want to ask them about the process. Did you consider this? Did you hear from this witness? But the qualification I'm giving you is that you may not have someone who feels comfortable, justifiably so, elaborating upon findings that a 5-member body has voted on when that person doesn't necessarily know whether the elaboration would be approved by a majority of that body.
I mean, I absolutely hear my colleagues' concerns about the fairness issue. I agree with Supervisor Wiener and his comments about that we are experienced in dealing with these issues where people have different allotments of time. But I do agree as well that to provide context is important, but it seems like they might only, in your estimation, be reading from a written record to begin with. Something close.
It's hard for me to speculate. I won't be making the presentation. I'm not sure who would. I'm just saying that one would expect that they wouldn't want to stray much from the written findings because they might not feel they have the authority to stray from those findings that were voted on by the Commission.
Okay, thanks.
Supervisor Campos.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, I'm grateful to my colleagues for this discussion. I think it's been a very thoughtful discussion. I don't really know what the right answer is. I think that the point that Supervisor Avalos makes is a good one. That said, I will support the approach that President Chu has outlined, and I think it works for a number of reasons. One, I do think it recognizes that there might be a benefit to a presentation, though I think that we have to be very vigilant to make sure that the presentation is different in nature than the one that a party to this proceeding, like the mayor or the sheriff himself, would make. The second point is that it recognizes that it is a different kind of a presentation, so in that sense, it doesn't need the same amount of time. So I think that it's probably a good way of compromising and addressing some of the concerns. So I think it makes sense, and so I will be supporting it.
Colleagues, any additional discussion? So at this point, Supervisor Avalos' motion has been rescinded. My motion is on the floor. Can we take my motion without objection? Colleagues, without objection, the amendment is made. And then if we could take, unless there's further discussion, can we take a roll call vote on the motion as amended to be approved? Madam Clerk.
Supervisor Avalos?
Aye.
Avalos, aye. Supervisor Campos?
Aye.
Campos, aye. President Chu?
Aye.
Chu, aye. Supervisor Chu? Chu, aye. Supervisor Cohen?
Aye.
Cohen, aye. Supervisor Ellsbernd? Ellsbernd, aye. Supervisor Farrell?
Aye.
Farrell, aye. Supervisor Kim? Kim, aye. Supervisor Marr?
Aye.
Marr, aye. Supervisor Olagi? Olagi, aye. Supervisor Wiener?
Aye.
Wiener, aye. There are 11 ayes.
The motion is approved as amended.